So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, my son, Graham Hart. Graham grew up in Denver, in the Park Hill and Hilltop neighborhoods. He graduated from Denver East High School, then moved to Hawaii and graduated from the University of Hawai, Manoa in 2015 with his doctorate in architecture, and I might add with honors and distinction. His over 300-page dissertation was entitled Tropical Modern Residential Architecture, Elements, Vocabulary, and Language. His professional work varies from human scale to residential and commercial projects. His personal and academic research work focuses on mid-century architecture in the tropics, where Graham has documented forgotten modern gems and led restoration and education efforts for buildings of this period. He's a practicing architect and co-founder of Kokomo Studio and teaches as a lecturer at the University of Hawai School of Architecture. He's also served as Docomomo US Hawaii chapter president and co-chaired the 2019 National Docomomo Symposium. He serves on the advisory board of the Willis Strand House and Foundation and also serves on the State of Hawaii Historic Places Review Board. Currently, between working his two jobs, involvement in two nonprofit organizations and the state board, Graham is working on renovating his mid-century open-air apartment in the Makiki neighborhood of Honolulu for himself and his dog, Annie. Graham, that's up to you now.
All right. Thanks, Dad. Cool. Yeah, no, happy to be here. Yeah, this is kind of fun and exciting. I've been part of Docomomo Hawaii for quite some time, and our business meetings every month go a lot longer. That's also probably because we also have wine usually at our meetings. So we usually don't have a presentation or what the box story thing that we call here in Hawaii during our business meetings. This is kind of cool to see into you guys' chapter and how you guys are running things. I wanted to give a presentation kind of a little bit about everything. There's so many different architects and great houses and great buildings in Hawaii that it's hard to just kind of narrow it down to just one thing to give an overview. So what I'll try to be doing is giving a presentation on a little bit of kind of like the setting and the context of Hawaii, why our architecture at mid-century and post-war kind of was special and unique, and then dive into some examples of some of the local architects here, some of the houses that they designed, and kind of like what ties them all together. Let me know if you can't hear me, if the audio cuts out or anything. Okay, so in Hawaii's kind of architectural history, I think one thing we talk about that's a little bit different than when you talk about modernism elsewhere in the world is instead of saying kind of like mid-century architecture, we really kind of talk about architecture as being like pre-war and post-war, just because the war had such a big impact in Hawaii. And modernism was here pre-war, but it looked different than the modernism that came post-war. So I would say that the architecture kind of pre-war was very regional in its style and was kind of starting to evoke a little bit of modernism. So they were kind of looking at modernism as a bit of more of like a stylistic approach to kind of like make a building look more contemporary or updated or something like that. But it was regionalist first. After the war, architecture kind of shifted. It became modernist first. We were suddenly really connected with the rest of the world. We were really connected with the rest of the US. And so our architecture became a bit more international in style. And then it was kind of regionalist second, meaning that it was a modernist building done with kind of regional characteristics, materials, and things. So that's kind of the shift that occurred in that kind of pre-war, post-war modernist architecture. At this time, there was a local Hawaii architect named Harry Seckel, and in 1954, he published a book called Hawaiian Residential Architecture. And it's just this little pamphlet of a book, but it's one of my favorite texts on architecture from this period. And what's so great about it is that it kind of captures the ideals of architecture from this time, but it was also kind of captures this moment where a lot of these architects that I'll be talking about tonight were just kind of starting off. Their careers spanned, for 60 years or so or longer, but this is at this point when they were kind of not quite at their peak and not quite at their mastery, but we're starting to do some really exciting things. In that book, he talks about what typically makes architecture in a certain area have a commonality to it, like a common language, or the environmental, regional factors that would make a kind of a consistent style. And his argument was that there's these typical 7 factors here that would make a normal style, but that Hawaii was so unique in that all of these things didn't force any one certain kind of stylistic choice for all architecture and all architects. So these factors that he talks about are isolation, materials, economic conditions, climate, setting, cultural background, and something that he thought that would be the thing that unites all Hawaii's architecture, which is this idea of environmental living. And I'll kind of use his framework to describe what was happening in Hawaii at the time and why architecture looks different. So to start with this idea of isolation, right? So in some places in the world, isolation makes all the architecture kind of look consistent, right? You can think about like traditional Japanese architecture looks so consistent because they isolated themselves from the rest of the world. So they had time to develop and make their own choices and kind of not a lot of outside influence. But in this period of post-war Hawaii, we were, at the forefront of American culture and everything that was happening at the time. We were the only American soil to be attacked during the war. But then also kind of post-war was, the jet age and the tourism boom and just this enormous increase in population, in visitors, in expenses, the military, putting money into connecting Hawaii with the rest of the world, the transatlantic cable, just so many things were starting to happen at this point. And kind of, there's this quote that within 30 years, a rural agrarian society dependent upon sugar and pineapple for its livelihood transformed itself into a alluringly cosmopolitan financial hub for the Pacific with the travel industry as its mainstay. So it really switched characters. Materials is this other factor. What are the things that are kind of commonly used, and is there enough of any one material to make all of our architecture kind of consistently made out of that? And we didn't really have that. So what wound up happening, instead of people often ask when they come to visit Hawaii, are there always tropical hardwoods and things like that used in the architecture, or is there always lava rock used in the architecture? And the answer is kind of no, there's not an abundance of any one local material that you see it ubiquitously throughout all of our architecture. But for sure, koa and other kind of exotic local indigenous woods are used in the architecture, and lava rock is used in the architecture, but not so consistently that becomes the kind of part of the style. Instead, you see a lot of economic materials, right? So a lot of concrete block, a lot of redwood that was shipped over from the Pacific Northwest. That was the cheapest thing to build out of back in the day. Single wall construction, tongue and groove boards put together, and they were resistant to rot and termites, and it was just this cheap material. So a lot of the architecture that you see here is built out of things that were economical, cheap, and could be locally sourced. A lot of concrete, because concrete could be built out of, basically 2 out of 3 of the materials that goes into concrete could be locally sourced. So we don't have a lot of architecture with big expanses of steel and glass like you see elsewhere in the US during this period. The economic conditions. So here's some cool statistics from this point. So during a time between from 1950 to 1970, Hawaii's population more than doubled. The number of automobiles more than tripled. The number of visitors jumped from 47,000 to 1.75 million. So this is just in 20 years. And just in the time within 1 decade, from 1960 to 1970, the number of visitors increased sixfold. And the number of hotel rooms went from 9,000 to 30,000. Then the year after that, from 70 to 80, the number of visitors went from 1.75 million to 4 million. And then officially in 1976, visitor expenditures became the prime source of revenue for Hawaii, surpassing defense spending and agriculture. And so because of this large population increase and tourism boom, the islands went into a frenzy of development and buildings got taller, land switched from agriculture to housing to apartments to dense urban areas with high rises. So there was a lot of development that happened in this post-boom period. You know, Hawaii is known for its climate, sunny days, breezy weather and things like that, but also it's such a mild climate that you can make a bad building still work here. So it wasn't like it was so extreme that we had such extreme winters or extreme summers that the architecture needed to adapt. You could have a bad building here that, you know, as long as it didn't have a lot of sun exposure, it kept a relatively cool space on the interior. But good architects that were working here found ways to adapt their architecture to the microclimates. We have a lot of microclimates here. So like kind of slight subtleties between, you know, mountain and beach conditions and windward and leeward sides. And so the architecture started to kind of articulate itself to the sun, to the breezes, and found different ways to do that. The setting. So if any of you have been to Hawaii, particularly to Oahu, you'll see that it's a sudden shift from the beach to the mountains. So most properties have a slope. Most properties, we don't have a lot of land. We're islands, right? So most properties are quite small. And because of those kind of two factors, that we're always on a slope and we're always on a smaller site, most of the houses here had a smaller footprint than the ones you see in Denver. And they're always kind of hidden behind vegetation, but they also, if you get up high enough, offer these kind of, you know, splendorous, great views. Looking out, right? I mean, it's just, you know, get up above your neighbor and you can see, you know, all the way out to the ocean in most spots in Hawaii. Cultural background. So Hawaii, for quite some time, has always been the most like ethnically diverse state in the nation, and it's kind of this unique blend of Asian Pacific Islander demographic, and that was usually the thing that was celebrated most in the architecture, particularly in this period. There was a strain of modernism that incorporated Asian elements into their designs, you know, with motifs and details and railing, shoji screens, things like that. There was this kind of romanticized version of what architecture should look like in the islands. And that was this kind of Hawaiiana style. And then kind of in the other spectrum of this placemaking type of architecture was the tiki architecture seen in a lot of resorts, a lot of kind of the work of Pete Wimberly, one of the architects I'll be talking about. But then kind of the architecture that was made for the locals, the people that actually lived here, seemed to find this kind of common ground between all these different cultural influences, and is kind of this kama'aina style, something we might call today a bit more of tropical modernism. So this last idea, Seckles, was this idea of environmental living. And so he set up this whole book where he's saying, like, here's what normally makes consistent architecture. And those all don't apply to Hawaii. The one thing that applies to Hawaii is the way that we actually live. And we live outdoors most of the time. You know, all of our activities are outdoors. We're always kind of, you know, dressed for perpetual summer. We spend all of our time, you know, looking at beautiful scenery that we have around here. And, you know, the weather is generally good enough that we can always be kind of connected to outdoors. And so if we designed our architecture for the way that we lived versus kind of all these other factors, that was going to be the thing that made good architecture here. And with that, he kind of talked about this idea of the environmental home. It was this house that was both inside and outside, and kind of centered around these indoor-outdoor lanais and these spaces. And that idea of the kind of lanai being the main space transcended into kind of larger scale buildings too. A lot of our civic buildings are kind of centered around big lanais. Our state capitol is centered around a giant lanai as well. So that's kind of what was happening at the time in this kind of period post-war. And there was a lot of architects that were working and feeding this huge demand of population growth and tourism growth. So here's just a list of a bunch of architects that were working at the time. Vladimir Ossipoff, Johnson and Perkins, Alfred Price, Stephen Oikawa, Wimberly and Cook, Harry Seckel, Frank Slavsky, Lehman Frieth Haynes, Richard Dennis, Ives and Hogan, and Philip Fisk. And a lot of these architects weren't originally from Hawaii, but kind of came either right before the war or post-war. Some of them grew up here and kind of went off to school and came back and started working. And in that book, that Hawaiian residential architecture book from 1954, there's these kind of snippets of these spaces that Seckel kind of talks about being like these environmental home images. And so these are 4 different architects for different houses. And you can kind of see that the similarities that are starting to grow between these, where is the line between inside and outside? The use of materials, even like the furniture all seems to be, even though it's inside, seems to be outdoor furniture. So it's pretty cool images there. But I'll go into a couple of these architects and talk about some of their masterpiece works. So Vladimir Ossipoff is the most well-known household name architect in Hawaii. A lot of real estate listings will, if he designed the house, they'll say, oh, it's a Vladimir Ossipoff designed home. Or if it looks anything remotely mid-century, they'll say it's Ossipoff style, hoping to get a couple, extra value in their real estate listings. But Vladimir Ossipoff was an interesting guy. He was born in Russia, raised in Japan from the age of 2 to 16 in Tokyo, and then schooled in the Bay Area. Graduated from UC Berkeley and then moved out here kind of right during the Great Depression, and then worked until the end of his life in 1988, kind of solely in Hawaii, and made a big impact on architectural legacy here. His kind of most well-known residence, and probably the most well-known residence in Hawaii, is the Little Strand residence, which is up on Tantalus. Built in 1952. It's this great house that you can go visit now. It's a house museum. So if you're ever on island, go check it out. They do great tours. And it was built for the Little Strand family. And they're an interesting family as well, where Howard Littlestrand, Dr. Howard Littlestrand, was Swedish-American doctor who was actually raised in China. His parents were missionaries there in China, and he was kind of stuck in between going to school on the East Coast and moving back to China. And then during this period, got stuck in Hawaii, which is not a bad place to get stuck. And then eventually kind of decided to settle here and built this house, him and his wife, Betty, with Vladimir Ossipoff. And it's this great representation of indoor-outdoor living and kind of all these different cultural influences coming together. Ossipoff, at the same time, also designed the Goodsill residence in kind of a different context. The Little Strand house is up in the mountains. Kind of there's no neighbors to be seen. And then the Goodsill residence is down kind of closer to the beach, not quite in the beach area, but a little bit of a kind of a hotter area in Kahala. And so he kind of found these ways to design these houses with these different microclimates. So we're up in Tantalus, you might want to be blocking out the wind and kind of the cold air in the winter, and it even has a fireplace, which is an odd sight to see in Hawaii. The Goodsill House is kind of this indoor-outdoor, very kind of horizontal building, but also has a lot of elements that are kind of taken directly from Japanese architecture and kind of Ossipoff's own upbringing in Japan. So this kind of Engawa space, a lot of shoji panels and sliding doors, things like that. Ossipoff's own residence in Kuli'o'o, which is right on the water, basically has no walls. So one of the things I started to see in Ossipoff's work after seeing many of his buildings is that he designs his houses as these big roofs. And if he has to put a wall, it's there, sure, for privacy on occasion. But if it has to be a wall, it's a thick wall that actually serves as storage. So anytime you do see anything that's vertical, it's got multiple functions to it, and it's not just there. Like if it didn't have to be there, it wouldn't be there. And then everything else can kind of slide away and pocket away. So his houses just kind of breathe constantly. This house, the Blanche Hill residence in Kohala, was sadly demolished in the 1980s, but it was definitely this house that starts to resemble a lot of the kind of other modernism that was coming out. It has some undertones of the Farnsworth House, but where the Farnsworth House in outside of Chicago, in idea is a cool thing, to have a kind of glass pavilion raised up above the landscape. It doesn't function that well in Chicago winters, but here in Hawaii, that idea of a raised pavilion made a lot of sense. And he's got, you can kind of see in some of these pictures here, there's like 3 or 4 layers of doors, storm shutters, screen doors, sliding panels, and those can all completely open and slide away. And then basically all you're left with is this raised floor and this roof overhead. It really just kind of blends this space into the garden. Ossipoff's own cabin up in Palihua was kind of this house, this cabin, this project that nobody really talked about for quite some time, up until really like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. It was something that he designed for himself on leased land for his family. It's like a 1-2 room cabin, and was kind of left out of the history books for quite some time, mostly just because it was a small little project and inaccessible. And there wasn't really any published photographs of it. He didn't enter into the design competitions or awards or anything like that. But to me, I think it's one of the most significant projects of his to understand kind of his thinking. He wasn't someone that kind of talked a lot about his architecture. He didn't give lectures. But if you looked at what he built for himself on a shoestring budget, you can kind of start to see that these common threads between all of his other work for clients, that obviously had a lot of kind of give and take and compromise with kind of just how projects go with building for someone else that's not yourself. These things that kind of were held true in his work were exemplified in this cabin. So these indoor outdoor spaces, these kind of manipulation of kind of experience, connecting users to the site, all kind of came through in this kind of tiny scale little cabin in the woods. Interestingly enough, Ossipoff's so he graduated from UC Berkeley, I mentioned, and came out here during the Depression, and there wasn't any work to be had kind of in California, but there was work to be had in Hawaii. So actually he corresponded with some of his classmates, kept in touch with them, and invited them out here. So Johnson and Perkins were actually a couple of his classmates. Philip Fisk was another classmate of his that came out from Berkeley and did a lot of work here too. But Johnson and Perkins had their own firm. They had them and Ossipoff and Fisk and Price and some of these other guys all kind of like work together at certain times, to get these bigger projects. But Johnson Perkins had their own firm from 1939 to 1992, primarily focusing on residential, mostly just houses. It was mostly just the two of them, occasionally an additional draftsman here and there. This Atherton YMCA building is no longer around. It was kind of a cool, one of their larger buildings that they built. But mostly they're known for these very highly Japanese influenced houses. Alan Johnson's own house in Manoa, built in 1936, so pre-war, is pretty interesting. It's really a Japanese house, in some sense, taken right out of a history book on Japanese architecture and just transplanted to Hawaii. It's this 1-2-room space, built right when he got here, and another shoestring budget. But because of his appreciation for Japanese architecture and because of access to Japanese carpenters and craftsmen that were here in the islands at that time, whether they were first or second generation, he was able to create this really stunning, I would say, very traditional Japanese architecture here in Hawaii. Tommy Perkins built a house right next door to it, and it was in the same style, but has since undergone a couple of subsequent owners that have changed it and painted it, and you kind of see the bones of it were still nice, but you can look past the paint. It was quite a beautiful home with a lot of rich textures originally. But again, both of these houses are completely open air. They have shoji panels set back about 3 feet from a screen lanai. So there's a screen porch going down both of these facades here. But other than that, there's no enclosure to the outside. The Baker residence is in Akiki Heights, another kind of building in this kind of almost series of studies of kind of how do you take Japanese architecture and adopt it to Hawaii, but then make it modern. So they kind of played with roof forms and structure, but then use these kind of traditional Japanese spaces like the Engawa, which is this kind of outdoor, indoor screen space that helps kind of blur the threshold and also protect the interior. This is a house I've recently been able to access and document a bit more. Thomas Perkins' own residence, built in 1953, is on this really extremely steep site. And again, right next door to the Baker residence, they kind of started building all these houses right next door to each other. I think they did 4 on the street in a couple of different areas. And what's really cool about this house is it's L-shaped in plan on this steep site. And in this area, there's this big atrium, you can kind of see it here too, which has since been covered. But again, it's just completely screened in with bug screen. And then on the kind of the front side of it, the downhill side of it, is all bug screen as well. And other than that, there's got very minimal protection from the exterior. There's no real clear line of what is inside and outside. Again, this house has been kind of changed over the years, but pretty interesting. Alfred Price was a Viennese architect that was a refugee, came kind of during the wartime, and made a pretty big impact on Hawaii's architecture. I would say out of all of these architects that were kind of working at this time, a lot of them were kind of West Coast architects, and Price was probably the only real modernist, European modernist that came. So a lot of his work is a lot more modernist, but then using local materials like redwood. One of the projects he did was Mele Mele Place up in Manoa. Sounds a lot like one of the projects you guys were talking about there in Denver, where it's one architect developed a whole neighborhood with some shared amenities and things, and shared infrastructure. But then he designed each one of these homes custom, using various different materials. So concrete block, redwood, but very expressive and a lot more color and a lot more kind of boldness than some of his West Coast architecture counterparts. A lot of kind of repetition and rhythm there, and they're very interesting kind of forms there. This house has been unrecognizably altered. I think it still exists in footprint, but other than that, not much else. And I think if it still existed, it would be one of those rare gems that should just be talked about a lot more. It's this steel framed house, which we don't see a lot of in Hawaii. There's only been 2 so far in this presentation. The rest of them all been post and beam made out of redwood. So it's a steel framed house, and just like all of these inside outside spaces, and very modernist, right? I mean, it doesn't get any more modernist than that, but then kind of like the subtleties that make it a bit more of a tropical space, like the matchstick blinds, the kind of calling these spaces lanais rather than just kind of outdoor living rooms, kind of switches how they're thought of. Stephen Oyakawa was a local architect from Hawaii, and was a fellow at Taliesin, so studied under Frank Lloyd Wright. I think left right before Frank Lloyd Wright's death. And built a lot of really cool architecture that is very Frank Lloyd Wright inspired. I think Oyakawa's own business card mentioned that he was the kind of like the Hawaii representative of Taliesin, something like that. But you can see these clearly Frank Lloyd Wright inspired lines, right? The kind of bold horizontals. He even used the kind of terracotta red that you always see in Frank Lloyd Wright projects. Very interesting, bold cantilevers, and kind of the way he moves the roof and uses the materials. Some cool spots that, it's a lot of this architecture kind of, Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture seems kind of, a little bit heavy and not as open air as it should be in Hawaii. And so I think he's kind of like finding this common ground between like that style, that kind of, Frank Lloyd Wright's organic architecture, and kind of Hawaii living. This residence, not Manoa residence, is it? But is another one that's pretty cool that he did, that is in Kahala neighborhood, and very. I mean, like this shot could be out of somewhere in Colorado or New Mexico, right? I mean, the garden here is all cacti. It's all red brick. There's kind of this nice scalloping on the eave and the fascia details here. Could be somewhere else in the world, but interestingly enough, I think some of this landscape was influenced or informed by Roberto Burle Marx, the landscape architect from Brazil, knew the owners and had a connection. So it's a lot of history in this house, but I haven't been able to see the inside yet. Get into it one day. It's a pretty cool house to drive by though. Psyche residence actually wasn't Stephen Oyakawa's. It was Charles Psyche, was a draftsman that worked at Oyakawa's office. This house came up for sale. A lot of these houses and these photographs are houses that have come up for sale or I've been able to see somehow or another. This one was interesting, and again, it was very kind of Frank Lloyd Wright inspired, but used this interesting way to use material. They had this combed redwood. So the redwood boards were all kind of scored. You could buy it in that. Weldtex is, I think, the brand manufacturer back in the day, and used it everywhere and just really emphasized all the lines of this space. But this big kind of panoramic view looking out. George Pete Wimberly. So for those of you that know a bit more about tiki architecture, probably know a little bit about Pete Wimberly. I think he was probably one of the only architects here that really dove into that style. He was mostly known for his resort architecture, a lot of stuff in Waikiki, and then a lot of his stuff now actually in Honolulu, it no longer stands. It's with kind of like, it was at that point when resorts were starting to be built in Waikiki and then have now Waikiki's completely taken over, and a lot of that stuff was just kind of outdated so quickly that it got replaced with big towers that could see more people. But one of the projects that he did for himself, he didn't do too many houses. He was mostly known for his larger works. But his own house up in Manoa, I think, is a real rare gem, particularly for just how houses are built in Hawaii. Nothing else looks like this. It's got this checkerboard brise-soleil on the outside, where every other panel, one is glass and then one is bug screen. You can kind of slide them past each other to kind of manipulate how much wind is coming through the space. It's essentially like a tree house. The back side of it is completely open there, just a screen porch. The circulations on the outside. It's just a really fun things going on. It was definitely an experimental home for a kind of an ambitious architect. But some of his other houses that he built were interesting in that kind of like Johnson and Perkins and even Ossipoff built a very Japanese influenced house. So the Ernst residence, which is actually across the street from his own house, is basically another one of these just houses straight from Japan, copied and pasted right into Hawaii. An L-shaped plan centering around a courtyard and stepping down with a steep site. So very similar to the Perkins house that I showed you guys earlier. The Genkon, the space where you come in and take off your shoes and then step up into the main living space. There's kind of low railing, all the shoji doors. So this is what it looks like kind of today, back in 2019. Pretty interesting. Wimberly did I think a lot of his projects, from resorts to houses, had a lot of kind of iconography to it. They were they looked like an object, right? So his house is a big, block, right? A big box. Some of his other houses, kind of, or Waikikian is this parabolic shell. And of course, Wimberly's got to do an A-frame house on the beach. So this is what it looked like originally, and this is what it looks like kind of the last time it sold years ago. Pretty fun building there. The Charlot residence he worked on with Jean Charlot, the owner, who is a kind of a famous Hawaii painter and fresco artist. And this house is kind of this mix of kind of California ranch, Hawaii modernism, a little bit of kind of Spanish, Mexican, Latin influence in some areas, and even a little bit of French from Charlot's heritage, all kind of coming in. And then also the way that originally was, just kind of decked out was quite eclectic and multicultural, but has some great elements. A big cantilevering dining table that stretches from the inside to the outside, cantilevering steps, and then just some great elements of artwork being worked into the actual house itself. So that's a bunch of different houses, a bunch of different architects, but I want to talk a little bit about what was the consistent themes throughout all these different projects. Material palette, again, kind of going back to Sekel's factors for regional design. Redwood was this kind of prevailing material that we used at the time, right? So redwood single wall construction, T&G boards, where the inside material and the outside material are one and the same, but then just because one's inside, one's outside, you see how the surfaces age and kind of change differently. Concrete blocks, an exposed concrete block, right? We're not painted, not anything else to it, adorned onto it, but letting that kind of concrete block shine in its kind of natural, natural state. But I think that concrete block kind of paired with local materials. So whether it was locally sourced logs and sticks, or in the Charlot residence, used hapu'u fern as kind of this like bark tiles on the inside and the outside of some of those walls. combed redwood here, so some specialty redwood products. In the Johnson residence, looking at cork and other kind of sandstone, things like that, that could be, you know, a lot of natural materials or inexpensive materials that were made to look, you know, quite nice. Just a lot of wood millwork, a lot of wood kind of custom pieces made from most of the time Japanese craftsmen that were first or second generation. I would say also in Hawaii's architecture, there's a lot of honesty and structure, meaning because all of the walls don't have insulation, and there's no insulation in the roof, and there's no insulation in the floor, you see how everything's being held up. There's no way to hide anything. So the beams you see in the ceilings and everything are what's holding up the building. I think that this was both a decision, you know, aesthetically, right? It's quite beautiful. It helps articulate sightline. It kind of draws the eye out towards the view and kind of, you know, elongates these buildings and makes them taller or whatever they are. And, you know, really makes the composition more powerful. But I think it's also a little bit of economics, right? The more you got to add, the more it costs. So do more with less was the idea. So many different architects, you know, Ossipoff, Price, and others, Johnson and Perkins, all those architects that talked about, kind of have this honesty and structure. And that was, yes, a modernism thing, but I think it was also an economical thing. Attention to details. I talked a couple of times about how there's a lot of Japanese craftsmen out here at the time. And, you know, we didn't have a lot of surplus of kind of great materials or expensive materials they use. So things are mostly out of wood and redwood that was being brought in. But there's so much attention to the craft and how things go together, and taking these inexpensive materials and refining them and you know, adding little details and joinery to them, figuring out how they all kind of come together at these fine points, that like a lot of these houses became, you know, giant pieces of furniture, really, the giant, you know, cabinets or just pieces of millwork, because everything was hand planed and hand cut and hand done. And then that Japanese influence really stuck through in a lot of the residential architecture. So shoji panels, right? There was Shoji Hawaii and other kind of stores that just readily sourced and had available shojis for your home, or tatami mats for your home, or other kind of products that you kind of like parts and pieces from typical Japanese architecture you could buy here locally available. So I think that just kind of the availability of it, but also just the cultural context of it. You know, interestingly enough, this is Vladimir Ossipoff, a Russian guy, Alan Johnson, a guy from California, and Pete Wimberly. All these, at the end of the day, these white guys made themselves these Japanese houses. And I mean, Ossipoff grew up in Japan. Alan Johnson built this house before he ever visited Japan. And Pete Wimberly, I think, had visited a couple of times here and there for short trips. But, you know, they kind of, I think, just had this reverence for Japanese architecture and saw its applicability to Hawaii. Relationship to site is one of these other factors that I think is consistent throughout all of these great houses in Hawaii. So sites vary. Talked about microclimates. Talked about different settings, different, you know, topography that you had to kind of overcome. But it's a lot of the architecture really engages you with these extremes of the site. So whether it's you're coming up to the Little Strand House and you see, you know, you come down this long driveway after driving up this mountain road, and you're kind of engulfed in this forest, and you come to this like one-story mountain house, very rugged posts and things on the outside. You start to get this glimpse of you know, view beyond and the transparency of the house, and then it brings you into this dark space, this kind of compression. And then it releases you into the living room where there's this expansive framed panoramic view of Diamond Head and of town, and just kind of the ocean beyond, and all of kind of the whole, really like, you know, 2/3 of Oahu can be seen from this house. And so kind of putting that experience at the forefront. And, everyone that walks in there just kind of like walks in and all, they can't help but say, wow, at the view. And yeah, I think houses today could be designed as, you see the view the second you drive onto the property, and you're always seeing the view, and 100% of the time you're seeing the view. But I think that the way that a lot of these houses work is that they really kind of manipulate the experience and frame the view rather than just kind of showing it off all the time. These houses are all naturally ventilated as well. There's no air conditioning, and other than a couple of fireplaces in some of the colder areas in the mountains, there's no heating. A lot of these houses are just open to the ventilation, but we have prevailing trade winds. We've also got Kona storms that come from a different direction and bring kind of inclement weather. So these houses needed to function not only to like open you up to the breezes, but also to protect you from storms when we have them. So these houses are finely tuned machines, and even though they kind of seem like these kind of very cool, ambitious, modernist forms, they're actually it's like instruments to perceive the weather. And then, this is two more ideas. This idea of environmental living, right? So a lot of these houses kind of bring you into the inside and then immediately just push you outside. The living space is outside. The dining space is outside. But really the only spaces that are inside are the kitchen and the bathroom occasionally. And everything else you're just supposed to do outside. You're supposed to be, in these kind of unwalled pavilions. So this kind of idea of like always keeping you in different environments was that idea that Saka was talking about. And I think all of these houses represent that. And then this last idea is actually this idea that came from a documentary in 1988 on Ossipoff, where they talk about his work being informal and dignified. And I think that this kind of phrase can get tied to all of the good architecture here in Hawaii, where Hawaii is a place that is informal, right? It's laid back. It's easygoing. It's hang loose. It's I show up to work in slippers and shorts. We wear aloha shirts, like that's as formal as we get, is wearing something that has a collar but flower print on it. So it's very informal and it's laid back, and you're supposed to be kind of easy, no worries. But also, I think the good architecture here is dignified, right? It's got humility to it. It's very humble. It's very understated. And it's got a lot of character to it that kind of makes you take it seriously. It's not so informal that it's not serious. It's not so informal that it has kind of no resonance with kind of architecture elsewhere in the world. It's got a lot of dignity to it. So I like that phrase, informal and dignified. They kind of seem opposite ideas, but I think it is represented in a lot of the architecture here. I think that's the lesson. Okay, and that's it. That's 30 houses in 40 minutes.
That was great, Graham. Does anybody have any questions for Graham? And I don't know how to make this, so I can see who is raising their hands here.
I could stop sharing here.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Any questions, comments, observations? Mike Skinner, you didn't see a lot of tiki architecture.
Well,
Yeah,
I was,
Aloha.
sorry, Grant, go ahead.
Oh, no. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Well, I
Maybe
was just,
comment on
you
that.
notice, I didn't know how to turn my camera on, but you see the picture I have in the screen there is Pete Wimberly rendering of the Waikikian there
Yeah.
in Honolulu.
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, a lot of the kind of the tiki architecture was mostly done for the resorts, right? So it was when people were coming, to tour and experience Hawaii that were from elsewhere, they kind of wanted this romanticized idea of what Hawaii was. So that, yeah, resorts and hotels, and even like we have walk-ups, 2-3 story apartment building walk-ups that are kind of in this borderline tiki style. But when it came to people's houses, you didn't see a lot of that. There's a few ones that actually we really did that were kind of, I think he was the only one that was playing with that idea of I want to say like fetishizing Polynesian architecture and using it as a kind of a motif to represent place, or evoke place. But I think he was the one that kind of did that in a way that was still classy.
Well, my understanding was that he was also the architect responsible for designing the original incarnation of the international marketplace in Waikiki, which brought in a lot of those flavors of Asia and the South Pacific.
Yeah, for sure. I think he was one of them, one of the architects responsible for that area. Yeah, the international marketplace, the Waikikian. There's actually still it's a Windward Shopping Center or something like that. The shopping center, I think I had a picture of in my presentation, which was originally this kind of like thin shelled concrete dome with these like tikis adorned on the outside and things like that. That has now been, I think in the 80s and 90s, that's completely cut up and covered over. But yeah, he had some really cool, cool buildings. Hey, Don. Yeah, Don's the actual historian. He could tell you more about.
Yeah, I think also with like what Graham is saying, it was mostly used for commercial projects rather than individual residential. And another thing, it went out of style. And so to find examples today are very, very difficult in Hawaii because, now it's come back tiki architecture, but in the 80s, 90s, no, it was frowned upon. And so it went out. So to try and find examples today, it would be very difficult. Then maybe there were some other houses that had some small things, but it would be hard. I think a lot of the higher level houses, the people were more sophisticated, and they would display the Hawaiiana not so much by tiki, but rather by antiques, memorabilia of that sort of thing. Get big
Artifacts,
bowls and things like that. That would be serving the same function, but on a more sophisticated level.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting houses that I haven't found too many pictures of is actually in that kind of strain of tiki is the house that Wimberly did for Edward Brownlee, who was like a tiki artist, in some ways, right? Did a lot of kind of the big, tiki idols and stuff like that at National Marketplace, but also a sculptor and other things as well. But he did a stilt house for him. I had a couple of pictures of it in the presentation. But even for that house, I don't think it was for a tiki artist. It still wasn't a tiki architecture house, but it was a cool house that happened to have artifacts and sculptures. So the Venn diagram of those two worlds could have lined up perfectly for that house, and it still wasn't tiki architecture.
Graham, I have a question about some of the projects you're doing in your personal architecture practice. Does it kind of overlap? Where are they historical sites or buildings that kind of fall into this type of architecture that we just reviewed, or are you doing some other, is there another portion of that where it's not in that as aligned, I guess?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we have luckily gotten a chance to work on some pretty cool projects here recently. We're working on this house right here by Alfred Price in Million Lake Place. We're working on, which is also this house. So this is earlier owners repainted it some crazy colors, but we're going to go back to the original color scheme. And we're also just got this house. We're starting to work on it this weekend. Perkins residence, restoring it back to kind of its original architecture as well. And then, so might be a few others in here. We're working on a this house up in Forest, up in Analyst area. So a couple of historic homes. I think as a firm, we wanted to do more stuff that was kind of like new architecture, new builds. There's not a lot of that happening in Hawaii. Everything's kind of built already. And then because of my own nerdiness for this period of architecture, a lot of people kind of reach out and say, hey, you know a lot about this era. Can you help us on our house? So works out.
Yeah, very cool.
So generally, it seems like a lot of the multifamily architecture, particularly in Honolulu, is modernist. But how much did these greats influence like single family tract homes, merchant builders, things like that? Is there a lot of modernism among single family homes, or are they more like mainland traditional looking houses?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're, well, yeah, yes and no. Okay, so yes, we have a lot of suburban tract homes from that era that are modern-ish. I mean, we don't have like Eichler, right? We don't have Eichler homes out here, but we do have, some kind of low-slung ranch homes, Hawaii Kai and other areas that were kind of all developed under at one time. And other kind of neighborhoods, Mele Place I talked about by Alfred Price. Harry Seckel did his own development, Manoa, Harris Drive, and some other projects that are kind of a bit more kind of track home-ish. Ossipoff actually had a little subdivision that he designed up on the ridge that was like, I think there was only like 3 or 4 model homes, but I don't know, probably 50 homes up there. So a lot of people say, oh, I've got this Ossipoff designed house. Yeah, technically you do, but I mean, it was a track home. So it was, one of 5 models, and they just kind of reorientated along the street there. But for the most part, I think a lot of the track homes that were being built were kind of built in this more of, how do we call it? Like a kind of a pseudo plantation style, kind of evoking a bit more of the work of C.W. Dickey. So kind of the Dickey roof, the double pitched roof, kind of those types of houses. There's a lot of the tract homes here. But yeah, the multifamily stuff was, a lot of that was, I would say, modern.
Yeah, I'd like to say too, Graham, that like you were showing many of the houses and you emphasized the fact that they're a single wall. The single wall actually came from the plantation and then was integrated into our architecture. And I think the houses of the 50s and the 60s bring that back, partly from recognizing it in other houses, not just plantation. And like most of Kailua, it was actually mainland developers who were brought in to build the houses, but they did do it with local architects. And so you have a combination of sensibilities at work. So you will get mostly single wall houses. Most of them will have lanai in the backyard somewhere. So you're getting some interaction there, although it's not as sophisticated as some of the more really outdoorsy houses. But so I think there is some overlap, and they are doing it, I think, compared to a lot of mainland modern house or ranch houses. These have less applied ornament or any, like I know the house I grew up in New York had like a brick front wall, which was a veneer, but it was that style in a ranch house. And here you don't see that. You just see the simple single wall, which again, I think what you were referring back to before, issues of economy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what's interesting is a lot of people come here and, when they take like the tour of the Little Strand house and they learn about, that it's all redwood from California. Like, wow, that must have been so expensive to bring all that redwood here from California. And it's, well, that was what we like built out of back then. That was the cheap stuff. And yeah, as Don was kind of alluding to, that the first kind of plantation houses, or really like the first like Western houses that were built here were kit homes from New England, brought over and just reassembled. And so kind of that idea of like kit parts type of construction very thin walls, kind of stuck with us for quite some time, really until air conditioning, and then we did actually put insulation in. Yeah.
Graham, you mentioned that a number of these projects that you showed have been torn down, and unfortunately, but you're involved in preservation efforts. What's it like there? I mean, how much fighting do you need to do there? Or do people really appreciate this, or are things being torn down all the time?
Yeah, a lot of fighting. Don does most of the fighting. Don's really good at registering these buildings, these significant structures, at least the state registry, historic places before kind of getting torn down. There's been some, because Docomomo Hawaii has been around for a bit now, and there's definitely been some battles over the years trying to keep some of these houses, some of these buildings, all kind of up. It's a fight. Our laws don't have a lot of teeth. I think you guys have more laws that protect things there in Denver than we do.
Once designated, maybe.
Yeah. Well, and just hearing about your guys's battle there recently with the house that you guys were trying to protect, and just all the different steps and stages. I think one example might be Don was able to register a bowling alley in Kailua here on Oahu with the state list of historic places, but then we could do that, but then that doesn't mean it's protected. It just means it's on this list now. And the owners could still, if they want to, tear it down and do whatever the heck they want with it, and it'll be removed from the list once it's been altered. But hopefully it's just kind of a way to just get people to get some attention on it, get some public opinion about it. So yeah, things get torn down here all the time. There's also this kind of anti-development sentiment here in Hawaii. So I think that's the only thing that might be helpful for us as a cause, is that we can say don't tear this down, and people will be like, why? And we're like, oh, because it's a cool historic building, and they're like, yeah. And we're like, oh, because we don't want a new building, and they're like, yeah, we don't want a new building. We don't want to change. So I think that's the only thing that helps us, is that people don't like change. They don't mind. They might not appreciate what they have, things of buildings, but they're anti-development. General building.
And Hawaii, just like every place, is seeing these monstrous buildings that have been built, Waikiki, whatever, that have nothing to do with Hawaii.
Yeah.
And they're ugly, and they're all air conditioned.
Yeah, I think Hawaii is one of those places that people, we sell it, right? It's a product. Hawaii is a product. It's been sold for generations now as to tourists to come and check it out. And it's been mostly sold as a product of look at our natural splendor. So people kind of have this idea of what it is, right? So a lot of actually that product gets transported elsewhere, right? And you have tiki bars elsewhere in the world that are trying to sell the idea of Hawaii, but in Chicago. And so it's kind of weird and ironic that back in Hawaii, there isn't this kind of push for keeping architecture more consistent and more. We actually, in one of our zoning laws in Waikiki, any new building, any new project has to evoke a Hawaiian sense of place. But ask anyone what that is, ask them to define that, and no one can. And what does Hawaiian mean, right? Is that Hawaii? Is that Jet Age, mid-century, post-war Waikiki? Is that Hawaiian as in traditional Hawaiian or Native Hawaiian? So there's a lot of complexities to kind of like the history here and what that idea means. But for sure, things get built that don't respond to anything at all. And that's almost like the safer thing for people to do. Like you can build a bad building here climatically and just pump it full of AC. Your AC bill won't be as bad as it would be in Arizona if you built the same building, just because, you know, it's not too hot. But I would say the same thing, like aesthetically, you could build an ugly building here and it would kind of blend in with the other ugly buildings. So to do something that's a bit more iconic is a bit more risky. Yeah, it's a challenge.
I don't want to monopolize. If anybody else wants to jump in, go ahead. But you've also got environmental challenges. For instance, I remember when you first mentioned the Wimberly house, but it was going to go on the market and you know, it can be done, but it had termite problems. And then the Charlot house, well, you know, they've got those, I call them blocks for lack of another word, which is not a material that's even available anymore. But then what do you, that's got an interesting, did that recently sold or what happened there?
Yeah, so the Charlot house, you know, is built by a well-known architect and built for a kind of famous Hawaii artist, right? So it's significant in a lot of different ways, not just for its design. Charlot taught at the University of Hawaii for quite some time. So at the end of his life, the house was gifted to the University of Hawaii. And for some years, it was under the control or the responsibility of the School of Architecture, which is cool. So that we got to kind of use it on occasion or go visit it and tour it. But the university administration-wise saw it as a liability. You know, it's a 60-year-old home, decaying, needing a lot of maintenance, and some of these things. So I think Wimberly was one of these architects that was always experimenting. So one of the things that this one is particularly experimental with is the materials. So this wall here, see in this picture, some of the other pictures and some of the other slides, is made out of hapu'u fern, which is a native fern species, and like we just, I think we can't harvest as much of that anymore to make tiles out of it and clad a whole wall out of it. And then also, you know, what kind of chemicals was it soaked in order to kind of make it, you know, resistant to bugs over 70 years, 60 years. So it's got these like really like unique, I mean, you know, a giant fresco painting, Charlot original, I mean, it's part of the house. So it's got these like things that just require a lot of attention and specialty in order to maintain it. And the university wasn't going to pay for that. So actually, yeah, I was in the news recently that they sold it back to the Charlot family for $1. You know, I had I known, I would have given them $2, but yeah, no, I mean, I think it was more of just kind of a, you know, transaction sign of good faith. It's just kind of like this was nice to have for a while, but we don't want it. Thanks. Take it back, please. So they're
Owned?
What's that?
It's privately owned now, and so somebody living there, or?
It's privately owned. The grandson of Jean Charlot is kind of taken up managing it, or, you know, there is a Charlot Foundation, which actually manages the whole art collection, but it's not in the house isn't part an asset in the foundation or anything like that. They're not quite connected yet. They're obviously it's the same people in some ways, but it's not you know, legally connected. So it's also this is one of the few properties that has a use easement connected to the Historic Hawaii Foundation. So basically, it can only be used as a private residence, or it can be used as for like tours and educational purposes, but it can't be used for commercial use, and it can't be torn down. Now, this is like one of the few houses that actually has protections in place. So there, but it's in a residential neighborhood, so they're trying to figure out, navigate. And so one of the issues that the university had was it's kind of like, okay, what do you do with this thing? It's sure the family can move back in, but really it should be used as kind of this educational resource. But you can't make any money off of it because it can't be commercial uses. So like it's a tough position. But it's sad that it's no longer with an institution that hopefully could have had the governance to take care of it, but it's good that it's back in the right hands. I would say another house example recently was Ossipoff's designed Goodsill House.
Yeah.
Which was on the market back in 2019 when we were there for the symposium. We got to tour it. It was then bought by a family who had never heard of Ossipoff and bought it for a zip code. Didn't really realize that it was a historic residence and that any changes that they wanted to make had to go through a review process or face paying back taxes if it was, altered to the point that it was removed from the list of historic places. But one of the alterations, there was a bunch of alterations, but one of them was like, well, let's move the glass line to this outside edge of the lanai, and let's add an addition and completely gut the interior. All these things that were just like Docomomo Hawaii heard about it, and we're losing sleep over it and cringing and dying softly. But luckily, the owners that bought it from, and this was another house that was donated to an institution. It was donated to the Honolulu Museum of Art, and with an endowment, and like had a way to kind of maintain it. But then the museum just sold it to the highest bidder. But those owners also put it on the market maybe a year ago now, and some really good people have bought it and actually undid some of the things that those owners had done and are trying to restore it back. And this is a win in our book, but yeah, I think each one of these houses has gone through a story of, is it going to get torn down or not? Some of them do. Right? This one is torn down. This one, I think the interior is altered. I can visit it. So I only got black and white photos of them.
Anybody else? Any questions, comments?
We can keep on talking, but I want to go ahead and move to adjourn the meeting.
All right. Officially adjourned. Anybody can leave now if they want to, but you don't have to.
Thank you, Graham. That was awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah. Thanks for listening.
Well, good presentation, Graham.
Thanks, Don.
Don, I don't remember meeting me when I was out there for the symposium. That was 4 years ago. No, 3 and a half years ago.
I get all of my facts from Don, so I'm really just regurgitating his books and his knowledge.
Great. So what do? You're just like always scrolling through the MLS to find out some of these houses that are hitting the market, getting in there, taking photos.
Yeah, for the most part, a lot of those were from that. I think the recent ones that I've seen with the Johnson and Perkins houses, I saw all of those within the last year. And that was just, I knew someone that lived at one of them. I met someone who at the dog park who lived in one by chance. And then they introduced me to their neighbor. And then now that neighbor has now become a client. So it's word of mouth. I think after 15 years of being here, people saying, oh, you're that guy that always looks at mid-century houses. People say like, oh, come check out my house.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
Adam and I don't know what that's like at all.
Yeah, I bet, right? Yeah.
It's easy for us.
The question is though, so what do they sell for? Do they sell for a premium out there like they do here?
Well, everything's a premium out here. none of these houses are affordable.
No.
But what's interesting is like, if it's got Ossipoff's name attached to it, it will usually sell for more. If it, I'm worried about when some of these houses, like some of the ones I showed, which are kind of like the architect's own houses, which are these small little houses, are sold in really nice neighborhoods, what those would sell for, because their land is probably worth more than the house now at this point. So are those going to get sold and to the wrong owner and torn down and then replaced with something because it's, it's a 1-bedroom house in an area that the house might, the next door neighbor is like $2 or $3 million. So how are you going to have a 1-bedroom house in that neighborhood? So
That's the battle we just lost, that.
Yeah.
House.
But that was a big house. Like,
Big
that's the
house.
sad thing is like, that was a big house, but
That one
the
was fit for the
land.
neighborhood.
Yeah. Land's
just
worth more.
land.
Yeah.
But that's Alan's house is exactly that.
Yep.
Right.
Which is why we're moving to land market.
Well,
Yes, here what we were talking about with the National Register, that gives only small protections, but it doesn't really make it where you can't tear them down.
yeah.
But hard because certain areas, that's unincorporated Arapahoe County, so that's kind of like your best level of protection over there. And so we have different rules too, that we don't always get the full protection, but
Yeah,
we hope that people follow guidelines. We hope that people use the historic tax credits for it.
the city of Denver has the most teeth, but there are a lot of good examples outside of the city of Denver that
Yeah.
we can only do so much to protect.
And the city of Littleton has some, if it's in Littleton proper, has some pretty good teeth on some of theirs. We just made the downtown area of Littleton a full historic district, so nothing can be
Wow.
torn down there. That's a significant building and part of it, and it took 30 years for them to actually put something that had teeth on that one. Because all the property owners kept making it, so it was an opt-in district for a long time, and now we just finally got it a year and a half ago, where it's officially protected.
Wow.
And one of the things
It's
that
a
Denver
process.
has done that's somewhat positive, at least provides us an opportunity to try to protect buildings, is that if you want to demolish a building in the city, you have to prove that it's not historically significant. And if the city
Yeah.
finds that there may be historic significance, they provide an opportunity for the community to attempt to landmark the building. When that's what happened in this house that we lost on, though, is it's not a guarantee that it'll be protected,
Yeah,
but it at least gives the community an opportunity.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's attention too late a lot of the time. So,
Yeah, because the deferred maintenance and all those types of things, right? That'll kind of
Exactly.
bring the value of the house down to maintain it. I think Don's still on, so I'll ask him. I think we used to have a law that was similar to that, but I think it got changed around the time that I moved here. That any house over a certain age or any building over a certain age kind of had to go through a review, was historic or not. But then I think there was a big push to actually get rid of that. Because, we have a lot of cheaply built houses too that are old or over 50 years old, and people couldn't always tear them down and build something new. So it's holding up a lot of processes. And our permitting office here is ridiculous already. So just kind of any additional hurdles, I think people are against. But then that just means things fall through the cracks and get lost. And